and welcome to some more teachings on the last week of Christ, presented for the British Bible School by Mark Hill. This is the 10th in 12 lessons, and we find ourselves now in the garden where the arrest will take place, followed by the trials of Jesus. In Mark 14:32-33, it records, "And they went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, 'Sit here while I pray.' And he took with him Peter and James and John, and began to be greatly distressed and troubled." This is also recorded in Matthew 26:36-37. 8 of the disciples were to wait in one place, maybe as an outer guard against surprise. Peter, James and John went with him. All of them were to watch and pray so that they will not enter into temptation. At a time of difficulty and sorrow, you really do want to be with people that you love and who love you. Whilst we might speak of personal faith, we do need other believers to associate with, worship together with, and pray with. Jesus wanted this time with God to prepare for what was coming. However, it seems Jesus needed human support and compassion, even though he must go to death alone. Mark 14:33 speaks of Jesus being greatly distressed and troubled. The two Greek terms add a particular force together. It is almost implying that the disclosure of the sorrow came on him, if not literally, as a surprise, or at least with a new and unexpected force, because really now the time was very much at hand. In verse 34, Jesus goes on to say, "My soul is very exceeding sorrowful, even to death." It's as if his agony would crush the very life out of him before he even got to the cross. The Greek tense suggests a growing intensity in the struggle that Jesus was going through, so that his sweat became, as it were, great drops of blood. This is not unknown to the medical world. The term for it is hematidrosis. Note that this is mentioned by Luke, the physician. There's a record of Leonardo da Vinci writing of a soldier who had sweat drops of blood. The agony of Jesus was for the sin of the world, all the crimes, the wrongs and depths of iniquity for which our wage is death. What if he should fail? The whole world would be lost. He's agonizing over this, truly. And going a little farther, he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but what you will." Is it possible that in some other way than by his suffering and death, salvation might be found? Might God find some easier way? Surely he would, if he could. Some suggest that the greatest anguish of Jesus was from the fear that his bodily strength might let him down, that he might die before reaching the cross. Satan certainly would have been happy with that. His bodily resurrection is needed as a proof of his power over the grave, and the cross is needed for his atoning work to be complete. How much poorer the world would have been if the cross and the shedding of Jesus' blood never happened. Was he pleading to be delivered from death in any other way, so that he might come to the cross and die in that way? Did he want to be delivered from the bitter cup of having his atoning work made incomplete and ineffective? You see, the bitter cup is certainly of suffering. Is he suffering over what is going to take place? Could it be a suffering that it might not happen, and therefore the world be lost? And his love for us is making him agonize over this. Abba, Father, the Aramaic word for father. The very word father implies trust, or at least it should. We know there are fathers who are not the perfect picture of what a father should be, but God is. All of those things that a father ought to be is what we find in God, our Father. And so Jesus is trusting in his dad. All things are possible, but not all things might be wise and good. His Father was all powerful and all knowing, and if the cup was not removed, it wasn't from a lack of power, or of wisdom, or of goodness. The cup holds all the agony and sorrows which were coming upon him. To desire for its removal, even with intense longing, was perfectly right and acceptable. There's no shame in it. I mean, I don't want to suffer for the cause of Christ unnecessarily, but if it came to it, would I? Would I have that strength? Jesus said, nevertheless, not what I will, not what I desire, but what you will. Faithfulness is not seen in merely submitting to the Father's will, but desiring it, praying for it. This prayer, your will be done, contains the essence of faith, a faith that expects an answer, calmly trusting in God to know what to do for the best. Am I at that place in my faith? Do I eagerly ask out of selfish purposes? Or am I desiring the will of God because I really want to do his will in his way rather than my own? After each period of prayer, Jesus came back to the disciples, and he came and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Notice that he said this to Peter, the one who was loudest in professing his loyalty. Yet here he is asleep. Is he really that loyal? Surely he would have been wide awake if he was prepared to go to death with Jesus. Here we see just another gentle warning to Peter to be on his guard. If the spirit truly is willing, but the flesh is weak, it's not merely an excuse. It's a reason why he should strive harder to stay awake and stay with Jesus. From Matthew 26 and verse 43, they couldn't keep their eyes open, and Luke explains the tiredness in Luke 22 verse 45 was from sorrow. Their grief, not ignorance or indifference, made their eyes heavy. At troubling times like that, don't we feel tired and exhausted with the pressure of it all? So keep in mind, it was very late, after midnight, long after their accustomed bedtime, as it were. They'd also had some intense conversations with Jesus. Their minds were intensely strained, and now in the silent stillness and darkness, there was a natural reaction that came over them. Perhaps with a deeper sympathy for Christ and a fuller realization of the crisis, they would have been able to stay awake. Or maybe this indicates that they still don't fully understand all that's taking place. Of Jesus was answered, and as a result, a spirit of peace surrounded him. We can notice that the answer was threefold. It was answered through the strength that was given him to drink the cup, and the knowledge that in having drunk that cup for us, it would change into a cup of blessing. It was answered in the same way God answers our prayers, and as God answered Paul's prayer, that sometimes that thing that troubles us is not removed. The thorn in Paul's flesh remained, and an angel strengthened Jesus. So there are two ways of answering a prayer for the removal of a burden or suffering. In one, the burden is taken away, and we remain the same person we were before. In the other, we are made so strong that the burden is no longer a burden. The latter is by far the best way of receiving an answer. Paul did keep his thorn in the flesh, but God's grace was made sufficient for him. If clearly before the vision of Jesus there had appeared two choices, the one of escape from the cross, but with that also the failure of his mission, the triumph of evil, the loss of innumerable souls, no crown, no glory, no abiding on the right hand of God, all lost because the suffering was taken away. The other choice, that of the cross and its agony, but with it the redemption of the world, the glory of God, the joys of millions of the saved, the crown of triumph over evil. Who doubts which would have been Jesus' real innermost prayer? His prayer was answered because the cross was changed to a crown. Gethsemane, a garden, became paradise. Death turned into immortal glory. To the disciples again a third time in Mark 14:41, and he said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking rest? It's enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners." This wasn't a sarcastic remark, not even a reproof. Perhaps it was a kind permission of love. Jesus had returned, and now they didn't need to watch anymore. He could watch for himself. Notice that in sleep the disciples forgot their sorrow. However, how did Christ conquer his sorrow? It was by prayer. Jesus then hears the approaching traitor and his group. It seems that the hour has now come. Judas had brought with him an entire detachment of soldiers to capture Jesus. The term used was that for a Roman cohort, a body of 200 to 600 men. It's impossible to say how many on this particular occasion, but it's certainly used for a large number. A great crowd is what is termed there in the Gospels. The chief priests and the elders were also present. Now, the chief priests had no jurisdiction over Roman soldiers, and it would need Pilate's permission to use them. Now, later on, he doesn't seem keen on this whole event, so it's not that likely that he would give permission to have his men used to capture Jesus in this way. So these were most probably the soldiers of the Sanhedrin rather than the Roman soldiers that were there. In John 18, verses 4 to 9, Jesus was aware all along of his eventual destination. He knows that his time had now come. But still, he asked, "Who is it that you want?" They specified Jesus. This definition will mean the others could go unharmed, which is probably what Jesus wanted. When they ask for Jesus, he replies, "I am he," or rather, "I am." This was the well-known and well-used reference to God that those religious elite would be used to. So this was a remarkable reaction by Jesus, wasn't it? And then the crowd. In verse 4, Jesus, knowing all that was to befall him, came forward. He knew what was going to happen, and still he came forward into this mob, basically. Confronted by Jesus, they drew back and fell to the ground. Why did they do that? This is why I think it's probably not Roman soldiers. I think they would have been more disciplined. But here, these people who were familiar with the term "I am," it had a particular significance for them, and the fact that he boldly came before them really lends itself to the idea that these were all Jews. But the unexpectedness of his striding out to meet them rather than running away from them would take them by surprise. And there is no indication in any of the text that Jesus caused these people to fall miraculously, as some have suggested. They went out to sneak up on him, knowing that they were being led by a traitor. Yet they were completely surprised and shamed by Jesus' reactions, so stumbled backwards over one another. As I said, some talk of the majesty of his bearing as being the reason that they fell down. But he certainly used no physical force. G.C. Morgan says there may have been the emerging of something we cannot interpret, a flaming of glory. I think rather that something in the man of Jesus as he stood confronting his enemies caused their shrinking and fall. The same thought surrounds how Jesus was able to do what he did in the temple when he overturned the tables of the money changers. But Jesus was willingly going to his death. Why would he make them collapse? It's important to note, I think, that it was when Jesus said, "I am," that they drew back and fell to the ground. The word he, as in I am he, is merely supplied in the text. Jesus said, "Ego eimi," I am. The expression also appears in other places. The arresting officers fall back at this bold answer and needed to ask again. Jesus needed to ask again who they sought before they managed to pull themselves together. Jesus clearly pleads for the well-being of the disciples. If it's me you want, then you want nothing with these. It would seem that the mob at first honoured Jesus' request to let the disciples go, but later in Mark 14:51 to 52, we read of an occasion where they tried to seize one of his followers, often thought to be Mark, who ran off, leaving his clothes behind. So the order of events here then, as we try and see the sequence. Judas confirms Jesus' identity with a prearranged sign to ensure that it's him. He said, "Rabbi," and Jesus answered, "Why are you here?" That's a curious thing to ask, isn't it? Jesus knew everything. Jesus is perhaps reminding Judas of how awful it is to betray his friend in this way, and not just his friend, the Saviour of the world. Then the soldiers came and threw their hands upon Jesus. So this talks of quite a violent action. They seized him, and it was a scene of roughness. It was violent action. Now notice there's been no warrant that has been presented for Jesus' arrest that's sworn out by witnesses, as it should be. There has been no investigating thoroughly, as the law of Moses demands in Deuteronomy 17 verses 2 to 5 and Leviticus 5 and verse 1. No investigating into the accusations of blasphemy made about Jesus prior to his arrest. All this is instigated by the priests and the Pharisees, and it's been done illegally. Luke records that Jesus' apostles asked if they should fight with the swords, the short dagger-type sword that they would have at hand. These are daggers copied by the Romans from the Greeks. And what was Jesus' response? He didn't want them to do that. Everything that was to take place was happening because it needed to, according to the will of God. As far as the conspiracy is concerned, a guide was needed to direct them to the place where he might be found, away from the multitudes, something that these hypocrites were afraid of. The crowd might turn against them for taking this innocent man. So who better than one of his disciples who would know the places where Jesus could be found, away from everyone else? There was going to be a pre-arranged sign of betrayal, which hopefully would catch the victim unaware. It would be an embrace, a kiss. However, Jesus wasn't hiding, was he? He wasn't trying to pretend to be someone else. Priests, officers, and elders led a huge mob to make sure that previous failures are not repeated. They had tried before, but there were too many people around. The high priest remained in his palace, rehearsing bribed witnesses in what they needed to say to make the false accusations sound legal. We're also indebted to these other three gospel accounts for a harmonization of the order of events at the arrest. Luke has got the briefer account and misses out some of the details that are included by others. But Jesus knew all along that Judas Iscariot would conspire with his enemies to betray him in some secret place away from the multitudes. The other three gospel accounts, besides John, combine to document the careful preparations by his enemies to arrest him. So they took great care to make it look like they were doing things properly. Soldiers, probably the temple police, and a great crowd, armed with clubs and swords to take care of any resistance, whether by Jesus' disciples or something else that Jesus might do to save himself. Having these soldiers gave an air of legality to this illegal thing that was happening. Notice that torches were carried to light the way, and to be able to search the dark corners of the garden in case he should be hiding, or any of his followers should be hiding. Weapons were brought, and cord was brought to bind the prisoner in case he tried to overpower them. Weapons were swords and clubs. Now notice that Peter didn't ask permission of Jesus, but drew his sword and struck a servant of the high priest named Malchus, cutting off his right ear. As Peter was not defending himself or the other apostles, Jesus told him to put away his sword. Taking the law into your own hands like a vigilante, without due process, leads to anarchy. So Jesus is giving an example of that to those who are doing just that. Force is destructive. The only kingdom that's going to last is the one of love and persuasion. Luke alone tells us that Jesus healed the servant's severed ear. Jesus rebukes Peter, and he surrenders himself to the authorities. No attempt is made to capture the disciples even after this violent act. Jesus points out that what was happening was in perfect agreement with the Old Testament prophets concerning the Messiah. Matthew 26 and verse 54 refers back to Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53 and so many others. The Greek phrase that's translated here, no more of this, could literally be rendered, allow it so far, meaning probably, let me reach far enough to touch his ear, rather than just telling Peter to stop, but also to allow me to move forward. Now here is a healing of Jesus where there's a definite absence of faith in him. There is no indication that Jesus tried to elicit faith from the person who's being healed. Not so with the charlatans today that try and promote themselves with their healing powers. The cup which the Father gave Jesus must be drunk. And Peter's action is at variance with God's will in that. The world must know that his kingdom is not of this world. If Jesus had wished to defend himself, he could have called thousands of angels, as we're told in Matthew 26 and verse 53. But he didn't do that. His mercy, his compassion, probably squashed what might have quickly turned into a blood-filled riot. What a lesson for us where retaliation is concerned. 2 verse 52 to 53 onwards, Jesus rebuked and shamed the mob for treating him as if he were a gangster or a highway robber. He had always taught peace. He had never done anything criminal. In fact, he tried to clean the criminals out of the temple, didn't he? They had plenty of opportunity, because he'd been out and about, to see his conduct and to know that he was not a violent man, such as Barabbas, who we'll meet soon. They could have arrested him in the temple, but they were cowards. They were afraid of the people. They were afraid of what others might think. They'd been afraid to take him while the multitudes thronged about him, because they knew that this was an innocent man. They would have attacked, probably, these chief priests and elders had they tried it on then. Cowards and criminals, as we know, operate in the darkness. So here in the garden, in dark, they must have the protection of the night, and they operate where people can't really see who they are. God is allowing the power of darkness to have its hour, and now that hour has come. Notice that Satan and all those who are aligned with him is to be allowed to exercise the ultimate wickedness at this time. However, the forces of darkness will be cast out and will be judged according to John 12:31 and 16 verse 11. We know that the apostles all forsake Jesus and would flee from where he is to keep themselves out of danger. So we ask, were the apostles cowards as well as those religious leaders? Well, they wanted to fight for him, but they were unwilling to share in his humiliation. That's quite a contrast, isn't it? Willing to go to the death, willing to fight, but we don't want to be humiliated. The office of high priest was for life. However, the Romans appointed another one to sit in on the Sanhedrin and all the things that it was doing, kind of a puppet on their behalf. And as Peter is denying the Lord is making his first defense. He's being questioned by the high priest, could be Annas or Caiaphas, about his teaching and his apostles. It might have been that the authorities wanted the apostles as well to make sure that this sect was completely crushed. This would further explain the denials of Peter. This wasn't actually a judicial trial, it was rather a preliminary investigation, shall we say. It would be in character for Annas to try to pin something on Jesus. They had very little at the moment, so what if he could find something now? So Jesus is questioned about his disciples and about his teaching. Surely the one asking the questions was well informed about both. Jesus' answer shows that the high priest's questions were from evil motives. I've always spoken quite openly to the world, he says. I've taught in the synagogue. I've taught in the temple. I've been where the Jews meet together, and I've said nothing in secret. So then, why are you questioning me? Jesus did not have two kinds of teaching, a harmless one for the general public and a very different one for the secret revolutionaries and rebels. His teaching was out in the open and public. Only those who refused to hear could not understand what was being said. Jesus defends himself by explaining the openness of all his actions. He'd never hid behind someone. He hadn't conspired in a closed room. All of his statements had been in the open for everyone to hear. Of course, we know Jesus taught in parables, but it wasn't two different kinds of teaching. Those who believed and wanted to know could fully understand what was being said. There's no secrets. But because of the answer that Jesus gave on this occasion, one of the officials struck Jesus, who then wants to know why he was struck. Jewish law required that evidence be heard from witnesses and that their testimony agrees. Then a prisoner could be cross-examined. So Jesus asked, if I have said anything wrong, let it be revealed by proper legal procedures. If not, why did you hit me? We understand, don't we, that illegality is usually supported by brutality. From here he's sent by Annas to Caiaphas, the official high priest. The preliminary hearing has allowed the Sanhedrin time to assemble together. It was Jewish custom for a prisoner's hands to be tied behind his back, and this, it seems, is the way Jesus was sent by Annas to Caiaphas, the official high priest. This was for the official trial, narrated by the synoptics Matthew, Mark. If Annas and Caiaphas lived in the same palace, and the Sanhedrin met there for this trial, then it would merely mean Jesus moving across a courtyard from one room to another. In both trials, the law of Moses and all the principles of human rights, as we call them today, were violated in what we can only call kangaroo courts. Before the trial had even begun, it was determined that Jesus should die. The verdict had already been reached. There was no idea of being innocent before proven guilty on this particular occasion. Mark 14 and John 11 sees where these decisions were made. Jesus was subjected to interrogation by Annas, who wasn't officially authorized to assume such authority. He was interrogated at night and during a feast, which were all illegal according to the law of Moses. Even the oral laws of Judaism, the Mishnah, stated that in capital cases, murder, treason, blasphemy, both trial and verdict must be reached in daytime. And in all the interrogation by Annas, there were no witnesses and no evidence was presented. Even in Jewish law, a man was presumed innocent until proved guilty by two or more witnesses and by accompanying evidence. There was no such thing in this particular instance. So Jesus is sent to Caiaphas's quarters, where the entire council of the Sanhedrin had gathered to seek cause to have Jesus put to death. This was merely to rubber stamp the proceedings and to make them appear to be legal, as it were. As I said before, even in Jewish law, a man was presumed innocent until found to be guilty by two or more witnesses and the evidence that accompanied it. So, by all the principles of proper jurisprudence, a mistrial should have been declared, and Jesus should have been released. Even Pilate, the Roman procurator, would later see through the hypocrisy and shame of the Jewish proceedings, finding no fault in Jesus in John 18 and through to John chapter 19. And pictured there is what is pretty much known to be the ossuary of Caiaphas's bones. Luke informs us in Luke 22 verse 56 that she saw Peter sitting in light of the fire. She looked and said for everyone to hear, "This man also was with him." Matthew and Mark say the maid called Jesus the Galilean and the Nazarene. Peter denied all this, saying that he did not know Jesus, but he sounded like a Galilean, like he could do. Immediately, in other words, at the same instant, Peter made his third denial, the cock crowed. And the next notation of time is when morning came, or as soon as it was morning in Matthew 27:1 and Mark 15:1, when they took Jesus before the Sanhedrin. Roosters crow at the first break of day, which is quite some time before the sun rises. Jesus was taken before the Sanhedrin at sunrise, not before, because the Sanhedrin could not legally meet to try capital cases before it was sunrise. Why did Peter, who so often had stood with the Lord in the face of opposition and difficult circumstances, deny him? Well, why do you and I deny Christ at times? Was there overconfidence in his own power? Was he disagreeing with God's revealed plan? Was he not prepared for the suddenness of this temptation, how subtly it came through a maid? Was he repulsed at how humble things were going to turn out? The only power available to keep him from denying Christ is a faith and trust in him, which acknowledges that his revealed will is absolutely true and good, regardless of what anyone else may say. At this particular point, it seems, Peter still wasn't too sure exactly what was going on. It's only Luke that records that the Lord turned and looked at Peter in chapter 22, verse 61. In one understanding and sad look, Jesus penetrated into the very soul of Peter. And Peter, we're told, remembered. The look of Jesus revealed to Peter his overconfidence and his self-will, which caused him great shame. Mark uses the Greek word epiballon to describe Peter's reaction. The ESV says, Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, and he went out and wept bitterly. The RSV translates the word, and he broke down and wept. Out of this experience, it seems, Peter found out about himself. This soul-searching look of Jesus actually saved Simon Peter, and it gave to the world the humble, spiritual giant of an apostle that we needed. Two men betrayed Christ, Judas Iscariot and Simon Peter. Two found themselves out. One killed himself, the other wept bitterly and repented. What constituted the difference? The fundamental essence needful for a character change and spiritual growth is a love for truth and trust in God instead of self. Peter longed for forgiveness. Judas did not. God's word cuts to our heart and reveals our true selves to ourselves. His word is able to pierce to the division of soul and spirit, able to discern the thoughts and intentions of the heart. Hebrews 4:11-13. When we search our soul in this way, we might weep bitterly, but if you repent and seek forgiveness, the Lord will give it. Sanhedrin has a lot to do with what's taking place here, so who were they? During the Roman rule of procurators in Judea, the Sanhedrin was composed of 70 officials plus the Roman appointed high priest, and it was restricted in its power to Judea. This is probably the reason Pilate sent Jesus to Herod when he discovered Jesus was a Galilean. Herod Antipas ruled Galilee. According to Josephus, the Sanhedrin was controlled by the Pharisees, who had the backing of the people. It was the final appeals court for a Jew. They could be charged, but they could appeal to this court. It determined questions of peace and war. It could try high priests, kings, even Herod was afraid to disobey a summons from it, and all citizens were charged there. It had the right to pronounce capital punishment until about 30 AD. After that, it could not execute a sentence of death without the confirmation of the Roman procurator. So we see the events taking place as they do. The Sanhedrin could meet any day except the Sabbath and holy days. They met from the time of the morning sacrifice until the time of the evening sacrifice. In cases where there was likely to be an execution, judgment was pronounced on the same day, but only when it was for acquittal. If the judgment was guilty, then that verdict had to wait to be pronounced for the next day. Capital cases were never tried on a Friday, except in Jesus' case, on account of that rule forcing a guilty verdict to have to be pronounced the next day. Intent on killing Jesus, all their own rules and ethics were thrown away. They had even decided on a guilty verdict before they'd brought Jesus to trial, before they'd even heard the case. They decided that at the unofficial and illegal kangaroo court held at the home of the high priest the night before. The night time, of course, a time when trials shouldn't take place. To summarise everything that was illegal about Jesus' case. They were intent on killing him. They disregarded their own rules and their own ethics to the winds, and their hate and their greed forced them into doing this. They had decided that at the unofficial and illegal kangaroo court, as I said, Jesus should die. So now we have to find out how to bring that about. So far, we've documented several blatant illegalities in the arrest, the trial, and the conviction of Jesus. First of all, he was arrested without a warrant by a mob on a feast day. Every one of those was illegal. He was taken before someone who had no official standing and who had interrogated abusefully and not released when he himself called for evidence for his arrest. It was taken before an illegal gathering of Jewish officials at night, having never been officially accused and having no witnesses to accuse him. All of this is contrary to the Mosaic law. This council, meeting illegally, had already determined his guilt and sentence. Witnesses were bribed to bear false witness against him, and their witness, even bribed and coached, did not agree with each other. Jesus was ordered to testify against himself, something no one should have to do. All the evidence and claims he made on his own behalf were not introduced into the court proceedings. He was allegedly arrested for one charge and, when brought before the illegal meeting of the council, was condemned for quite a different charge. He was physically abused, mocked, reviled, assaulted in the presence of civil officials who were charged with law and order and humane treatment of defendants. Finally, he was brought before the Jewish council, which was convened on a Friday, and given a guilty sentence which was contrary to legal practice of this council. It should not have been announced the same day. So there was no charge to answer, no warrant for arrest, no charge, no evidence, no testimony, no legal proceedings. There was no case. Jesus deserved to be dismissed, even on a legal basis. A mistrial should have been declared, notwithstanding the fact that he was innocent. This morning trial before the council was to give the council's murderous scheme a facade of legal correctness, which it didn't have. So they demanded, "If you are the anointed one, the Christ, tell us." Standing before Annas in John 18:19-23, Jesus said, "I have spoken openly. I have said nothing secretly. Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I said." Then before the council, in Caiaphas' house, under oath, when asked if he were the Christ, the Son of God, Jesus replied, "I am." Mark 14 and verse 62. Now, with a semblance of official correctness on their side, in the morning meeting of the council, they demand again that he say he is the Christ. In which Jesus answers them is a masterful exposure of their prejudice and their hypocrisy. He had already told them plainly, not once but many times. He had confirmed his claims with many miracles, some of which the men on that council had seen with their own eyes. Ask them. If he told them now again, they wouldn't believe it. They had their minds already made up to kill him for his own reasons. If he questioned them and tried to discuss the matter which they pretended to want to investigate, they wouldn't answer, because they really didn't want to know the truth. He had had many confrontations with these men earlier in the week, and much earlier in his ministry too, but they did not answer his questions then, either, for they had determined to murder him already. So Jesus says a very significant thing. But from now on the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God. In this statement, he is informing them that as the Messiah, the Son of Man is a messianic term taken from Daniel chapter 7 and other places, he fully expected to survive the death they had planned for him and to be seated forever at the right hand of the power of God. Even though they were presently judging him, he would soon be enthroned as their judge, with all the power of God given to him. He had said this earlier, the night before at Caiaphas's house. There he added the implication that he would be coming on the clouds of heaven, exercising his judgmental powers against them and their city and their nation. Statement by Jesus infuriated the council, and it prompted them to all cry out together, "Are you the Son of God then?" They wanted it on the official record that this Galilean rabbi had claimed to be not only the Messiah, but that the Messiah was God's Son, that is, God in the flesh. This was the great stumbling block to the Jewish mentality. That God could ever become flesh was impossible to them, because they judged the concept on the basis of their human experience rather than accepting it as a revelation from God by faith. Their interpretation of the Shema, found in Deuteronomy 6:4-9, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord," was that God could never become two or three. But the real meaning of that passage is that God can never be double-minded. He cannot be at variance with himself. He is one in purpose. Jesus proved conclusively that he and God were of the same mind. They were one in teaching, one in power, one in action. They were in perfect unity. Father and Son were one. Jesus' answer, as recorded in Greek by Luke, is quite significant. Literally, he writes it, "You are saying that I am being I am." So Jesus is saying, you've got it. I am the Lord. The statement I am being I am is the significant thing. It's the same as the statement of God in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 14 when he tells Moses, I am that I am. Luke put it in the Greek, hotai ego eimi. Jesus is claiming to be God. There is no doubt about it. And the council members knew it. So they shouted, "What further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips." They did not need any further testimony. There had been more than enough evidence to substantiate Jesus' claim as being true. Any more evidence wouldn't have changed the council members' conclusions, because their conclusion had been made in spite of the evidence that they already had. Jewish rulers had rejected the claims of Jesus to be the incarnate God. They didn't want him around, they wanted to hold on to their power. The apostles rejected the teaching of Jesus because, in order for him to be their Messiah, he was going to have to die a humiliating death, and that didn't fit the picture in their minds. So these last hours surrounding the Passover, the Lord's Supper, the foot washing, the talks on the Holy Spirit, the events in the Garden of Gethsemane, were focused on saving and preparing the now 11 apostles to become heralds of the glad tidings of Jesus throughout the world. Although these apostles deserted Jesus after his arrest, they weren't cowards. They did not despise Jesus, nor did they wanted to exploit him as Judas had. They were simply disillusioned. He had not fulfilled what their idea of the kingdom was. They still had this earthly viewpoint. They would, because of that, have gladly joined Jesus in a war to bring in by force a kingdom to renovate the present Jewish system. But it appeared to them that Jesus had become a passive victim of that very same system. To understand how they thought and they felt, we only have to read ahead to the words of the two disciples on the way to Emmaus, who couldn't figure out what was going on. These apostles understood and acknowledged Jesus when they saw him later as the Christ of glory. There they acknowledged, almost incredibly, that he had become victor and wasn't a victim. But for now, they're confused, they're disillusioned, and are not sure what's happening. Later, fortunately, they will understand.